00011, Phase 1. A few people were standing on the landing of a typical townhouse in Greenwich Village. One was dressed in normal street clothes. The others were all in some type of traditional robes. The only woman in the group spoke and said, "Mr. Pangborn, it has been a pleasure. I wish you a pleasant life and remember what I asked of you." The man in plain clothes bowed to the woman and said, "Thank you, master. I hope your life is filled with fewer issues in the future, and I will let you know as soon as I find out anything." He slightly nodded to the two men next to the woman and then turned around and began to walk down the street. The people stood for a few more moments before walking back inside. A dark-skinned man dressed in green robes was the first to speak once they were back inside and said, "I still do not like that he possesses so much knowledge, and we are just going to let him leave the order. Master Mordo, Mr. Pangborn will not upset the balance. I have seen his future many times, and in every single one he does the same thing. He is a man who just wants to live a normal life and not worry about the bigger picture like we do. Now let's go back and spar. I don't think you are completely understanding my lessons yet." Mordo visibly flinched at those words, but said nothing as he followed the Ancient One deeper into the sanctum. The next few weeks flew past quickly and my routine didn't change much. My clone would be programming Monday through Friday, while my parents were working. My parents made sure they had the weekends off so they could spend it with Emily and me, which normally included May and Ben at least once for a meal, sometimes more. Peter would join us sometimes with his parents, but most of the time he would join us with May and Ben. His parents always seemed to be busy working, so he stayed with May and Ben half the time. It kinda sucks, but they treat him really well, so I don't think he is missing too much. It took almost 4 weeks, but my clone finally finished the programming, connected the computer to the internet, and ran it. Once it was uploaded to the internet, it took about a week for the main program to go through and finish its first task, securing funds and setting up bank accounts for all of it. The main portion of the money came from stealing it from criminals. It wasn't hard at all to find it either. Criminals might hide it well enough. But the program I made would hack through everything and find out who actually owned the bank accounts. Shell company owned by another shell company that is registered in a country that won't share records? If they had anything online, my program found it. Once it collected all of the data behind these accounts, it compiled them into a list for me to go through. To check the list, all I had to do was connect to the internet after a week and run the program I made on the computer. The program I made acted completely separate from our home computer and lived online on different servers throughout the world. It would also move around and not stay anywhere for more than a few hours. The great thing about doing it this way was that if someone tried to find whoever was doing everything, all they would find is what servers they had connected from. It left nothing else to trace, since the program itself was doing everything. It was a pretty brilliant piece of programming, and I can't even take credit for it. Some hacker in my past life was the one who came up with it. They used it for over 10 years and no one even knew about it. They were only skimming hundreds of millions of bank accounts over that time though, like fractions of a cent at a time. They must have felt that if no one knew about it, it wouldn't count. Because once they had enough money, they made an anonymous post about what they had done. People didn't believe it at first, but then the base code was uploaded online and the person had even explained how they did it. It was chaos for a few weeks, while people figured out how to reverse engineer the code and figured out how to trace it back to who was using it. All the copycats who decided to use it were caught pretty quickly, but the original hacker who made it was never found. They had already removed their copy of the program and had stopped using it long before they even released the base code online. While I am not skimming any accounts, I am not worried about getting caught. I changed and upgraded the code so much, it is not even close to what the original code was at this point. I just wanted to use its server hopping ability, which to this day is still brilliant. Even Sam said it was one of the greatest things he has ever seen a human code. Pretty high praise coming from an AI. After getting the funds I needed for Phase 1 in place, I started Step 2. This step took almost 3 months to finish. Peter and myself both had our second birthday, while we also celebrated Emily's first birthday during that time. I have to say that Emily and Peter have the same eating habits when it comes to birthday cakes. I am also sure that my parents were over the moon when they saw how Emily ate her first birthday cake. I mean, we have a framed 10 by 12-inch picture of it in the downstairs hallway. The only other thing of note is my parents seem to be working on having another kid already. I have no idea how Emily can sleep with how much noise they make, Or maybe my hearing is just really good. At least I can escape to my mindscape when they start. It was early morning, up in the middle of some snow-covered mountains. Hidden somewhere here in the middle of the continental United States is a decommissioned SSR base. Or at least it should be. It is actually the first base that Nick Fury started to have secretly built back up with modern technology and equipment. It is being overseen by Sam Koenig, a trusted aide. Or at least that is what Fury thought. He had made a trip out here in secret to check on the base's progress and find out from Sam when the base should be up and running. But there is currently a bigger issue that Director Fury is having as he looks around the conference room he is standing in. It's all the people who shouldn't even know that this place even existed, let alone be here in the first place. He looks over at Sam, who is currently talking to one of his brothers. The frown on his face just deepens as he looks over the rest of the room. While he can somewhat rest easy that every person in the room has a connection to S.H.I.E.L.D., he looks to the one person who everyone seems to be avoiding. A man he never thought he would see again. Hank Pym. He probably has a worse frown than I currently do. Another person who was even more of a surprise to see was someone who helped train him into the man he was today. Peggy Carter was here, and sitting next to her was Sharon Carter, her great niece who was just accepted into the S.H.I.E.L.D. Academy. He frowned a little deeper. He turned his head back towards Sam as he said in an icy tone, "Sam, you mind telling me why the fuck all of these people are here? In a place that only you, me, and 3 other people should even know exists?" Sam froze mid-talking. His mouth snapped shut, and he started to turn pale as he slowly turned towards Fury. The rest of the room had also quieted down, and everyone looked at Sam waiting for his answer. This made it even worse for him, and as he tried to speak, he lost his voice. The only thing that could come out of his mouth was a strange wheeze. He tried to speak again, but still no intelligible sounds came out. As he was trying to speak again, another voice was heard from the other side of the room. "Are you trying to play a joke to lighten the mood, Fury? If everyone else here is like Sharon and I, we were explicitly asked to come here by you for a matter of the utmost importance. We were also told to make sure no one knew about it, not to be followed or tracked, and not bring anything that has GPS." Fury looked towards his former mentor and said, "I am pretty fucking sure I would have remembered if I told a bunch of random people about something above their clearance level." Hank glanced over at Peggy first, then turned to Fury and said, "You didn't ask me to come here. Someone else sent me a message. They said Janet was alive and could help me find her. I was then told about this place, how to get inside, and when I should get here." Peggy stood up and looked at Hank as she asked, "Janet is still alive? I thought that she died stopping that nuke?" Hank shook his head slightly before he said, "No, she went quantum stopping the missile. I had no idea how to find her, or even if she was alive because of that. Now someone who was somehow able to find me in hiding, and I couldn't find after spending over a week trying to trace back how they contacted me. They told me that not only was she alive, but they could also help me find her. I decided to take the chance." Everyone had stopped talking and was quiet as Hank Pym talked. Hank glanced around the room for a moment at everyone as he finished, before he turned back to Fury. As they were staring at each other, the wall behind Fury lit up and a face started to appear on the wall-sized monitor. Fury noticed as everyone turned to look behind him. He broke eye contact with Hank and turned around himself. On the screen before him was an older-looking nondescript Asian man. The only thing to really note was the man's completely black hair and irises. It almost looked like his eyes were completely black if you weren't paying attention. His eyes did a quick sweep of the room before he said, "Looks like everyone is here. I am glad you all could make it. But then again, when I asked you to come here, you didn't know it was me asking." 00012. Trying to make friends with a bunch of spies can be hard. Fury was the first to speak as he turned around and said, "Sam, I want you to start running a trace and find out where this is coming from." Before Sam or anyone else could move, the black-eyed man replied, "There is no need for that. You won't be able to find me unless I tell you where I am. Now I have a few hours today to discuss with all of you about why you are here, and I would really like to make this as streamlined as possible." Hank let out a defeated sigh and said, "He is right. I tried for over a week and came up empty-handed." Fury just nodded once to Sam and turned back around to look at the man once again. As that was going on, Sam went to his laptop sitting on the table and started to work. As he did, The man began to speak again and said, "That won't get you anywhere, Fury, but if it makes you feel better, you are free to try for the next few hours." Fury crossed his arms over his chest as he said, "And what makes you think any of us will stay here for the next few hours and listen to what you have to say?" The man on the screen smiled slightly and said, "Besides the fact that you want to find out who I am, so you will most likely stay for what I have to say on the off chance that Sam can find me. You are also curious how I would be able to find out about something like this base, since there are no records of this place in any S.H.I.E.L.D. database." Fury smiled back and said, "Those are valid reasons, but I don't need all of these people here for this. I could send them away, and it would just be me and you here." The man on the screen let out a laugh and said, "While you could order your agents to leave, I doubt Miss Carter or Dr. Pym would leave just because you asked them. Plus, if you tried a power move like that, I would just tell everyone how you lost your eye. Flurkins are funny creatures, aren't they? Did you know their stomach acts as a pocket dimension? Oh, but you already knew that though, since one was holding the Tesseract for a few days." Enough. Everyone looked towards Fury for a moment before looking back at the man smiling on the monitor. Fury's smile had dropped, and he stayed silent for a few moments before he finally walked over to a chair and sat down. After he was seated, he said, "You seem to know a lot of things that no one else should know about. Care to explain how?" To put it in a way that is easy to understand, I can see the future. Everyone was quiet as they thought about what they just heard. Fury looked like he was about to speak when Hank asked, "Say I believe you. Is that why you told me Janet is alive?" The man on the screen smiled again and replied, "That would be correct. In about 22 years from now, you find and rescue your wife from the quantum realm. I am pretty sure we could do it a lot sooner. But if you don't mind believing in magic, I think the Earth's Sorcerer Supreme might be able to do it even faster than us. I am not 100% certain though, and I really don't feel like talking to her." Fury raised an eyebrow at that comment, and a few other people were looking at each other and mouthing Sorcerer Supreme to see if anyone knew what the man on the screen was talking about. Hank, on the other hand, just laughed and said, "I am a man of science. I don't believe in magic." "I figured as much. I have a few ideas on how to speed up the process of finding your wife. I will send those to you later, but I would like you to stay here and listen to what I have to say since it also involves you." Hank shook his head as he said, "I don't want anything to do with S.H.I.E.L.D. after what they tried to do to me." The man on the screen smiled wide at that and said, "Even if it wasn't S.H.I.E.L.D., who was actually behind it in the first place?" Hank narrowed his eyes at that comment and asked, "You expect me to believe it wasn't S.H.I.E.L.D. when I caught them myself as they tried to replicate and steal my technology? While they might have been part of S.H.I.E.L.D., the people doing it weren't told by S.H.I.E.L.D. to do it. I know you confronted Miss Carter, Stark, and Mitchell Carson about it, but you never asked them about it specifically. You just left and never said another word. Miss Carter, did you or Howard task anyone at S.H.I.E.L.D. to try and recreate the Pym particle?" Hank looked over to Peggy, and she let out a sad sigh before she said, "No, it was Mitchell Carson. He was the one who did it. Me and Howard found out when you came in and gave your resignation. After you left, we stopped all research on it, and I demoted Mitchell for what he did. But you were already gone. The real damage was already done." The man on the screen nodded his head and replied, "Thank you, Miss Carter. Now, Hank, I know at the time you were starting to distrust your allies and even your technology over what happened to your wife. But I would like to assure you that your tech overall is fine, but you were right to distrust some of the people close to you." At this point, someone else finally spoke up. It was Peggy's niece, and they asked, "Pardon me, but it seems like you were trying to say that not everyone in S.H.I.E.L.D. is actually working for S.H.I.E.L.D.? "That was correct, Miss Carter." She put her hand up in a stopping motion and said, "Please just call me Sharon, mister." The man on the screen looked a little embarrassed before he gave a slight bow as he said, "Please forgive me. I never introduced myself. You can call me Ezekiel." Fury spoke next and said, "I doubt that is your real name. It's one of the names my parents gave me. Anyways, back to the topic at hand. Miss Carter, you remember Operation Paperclip, correct?" Nodding her head at the same time, she replied, "Yes, I do. The US brought over a bunch of German scientists after World War II. A good amount even ended up in the SSR and then S.H.I.E.L.D. after that." The man on the screen gave a wicked-looking smile at that and asked, "Even the ones who worked for Hydra?" Peggy didn't like the way he asked that question but replied, Yes, we took in any that were qualified and didn't commit any war crimes. Ezekiel's smile became a bit wider before he asked, could you remind me what Hydra agents like to say as they committed suicide? Peggy was having a really bad feeling in the pit of her stomach as she replied, cut off one head and two will grow back. But it was only the fanatics that believed in that. Plus, once Johann Schmidt died, Hydra fell apart on its own. Fury spoke next and said, so you want us to believe that S.H.I.E.L.D. is currently compromised by a Nazi group from World War II? Ezekiel laughed at that and then said, no, not at all. S.H.I.E.L.D. has been compromised by a cult that has existed long before any Nazis did. Here, take a look at this for a minute. On the screen, the Hydra logo they used during World War II appeared. Then slowly it split apart, and one of the logos turned into another image. It was black and white with a weird-looking skull on it. It also had some weird curls coming off of the top side of the head. After a moment, the second logo rotated 180 degrees and looked strangely close to the Hydra logo next to it. Everyone is familiar with the first logo. The second one is from a cult that was around in the 4th century BC, and this next one was used from around 800–1200 AD. On the screen, another logo appeared. It had a ram's skull resting above a crest. Then another logo appeared with a weird-looking ram skull on it. That one is from around 1200 to 1700 AD. There are a few more to see, but I am sure you all get the point. Peggy looked deathly pale at the thought that she tarnished Steve's memory by letting Hydra infiltrate HIELD and twist it to their own ends. A lot of other people in the room were looking very uncomfortable also. Hank was quiet, but he was looking over at Peggy. His face was an unreadable mask. Fury was the first to break the silence in the room and asked, so what? This group of people have existed for around 2,000 years and have been trying to take over the world this whole time? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, no, this started as a cult that was worshipping someone they considered a god. He was an inhuman, or at least that is what his people called themselves. He was a very dangerous and powerful inhuman. Because of that, he was banished to another world long ago. His followers that were left on Earth then founded a cult, with its main purpose to bring him back to Earth, so they could conquer it. It has changed a lot over the years, but its main goal is pretty much the same. Everyone else was silent as they were thinking about what they just heard. Fury was the first to speak as he asked, this inhuman was banished over 2,000 years ago. Shouldn't they be dead by now? I wish, but he is a parasite and lives by taking over people. The people die, but he retains the person's memories. He actually wiped out the entire population of the planet he was exiled to. It was the main reason he was exiled. He would have done the same thing to our planet given enough time. Someone else spoke up and said, Mr. Ezekiel, it's a little hard to believe this story. I have seen some pretty outlandish things working with S.H.I.E.L.D., but this is a step above any of that. A lot of people in the room nodded in agreement with the man's statement. It's always good to have a healthy bit of skepticism, Agent Coulson, but I can assure you that everything I have said is fact. But at the same time, it's just words coming from a person you don't know. So let me give all of you an olive branch and try to earn your trust. Fury scoffed at that and said, if you want me to trust you, how about you come here and talk to me face to face? Ezekiel laughed at that and said, I wouldn't do that for 2 reasons. The first is because I don't have the time. The second is because I don't want you to randomly show up at my house when you want to talk. Fury just glared at Ezekiel as Peggy started to laugh. A few other people, including Coulson, were smirking at the comment. When Peggy stopped laughing, she said, you are right about the second part. A few more people actually laughed at Peggy's comment, but stopped when Fury shot them each a glare. Once the room settled down again, Ezekiel said, so, my first olive branch to gain some trust. I just sent a list of bank accounts to Sam. Fury raised an eyebrow and said, you want to buy our trust with money? No, not at all. I just told you that the organization you run is infested. The people in this room are here because I know for a fact that none of them are Hydra sleeper agents. There are a lot more good agents in S.H.I.E.L.D., but these ones I know for certain. The rest I will have to slowly verify. The reason I am giving you money is because you won't be able to make any moves using funds from S.H.I.E.L.D. without drawing attention. Sam looked up in shock before he asked, there is close to $100 billion in here? Were you the one who pulled off all those bank hacks last month? No one has figured out how it was done, and none of the banks were able to retrieve the money. Yes, that was me. All the money I took was from criminals or terrorists. I figured we would put it to better use than they would. The man looked over everyone in the room for a moment before he looked at Peggy and said, "Now for the real olive branch of friendship. Miss Carter, I know where Steve Rogers is." 00013. An olive branch of friendship. Peggy stood up and yelled, "You know where Steve's body is?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "You misheard me. I said I know where Steve is. I didn't say anything about finding his body." Peggy was shaking slightly as she asked in a low voice, "Are you saying that he is still alive?" "Yes." Peggy collapsed back into her chair with her head down. The whole room had gone quiet. Sam had even stopped typing on his laptop. After a minute or so, she looked up with determined eyes and asked, "Where is he now?" "He is currently frozen in a block of ice, inside the remains of the Valkyrie. It is located off the coast of Greenland in the Arctic Circle. I have a couple satellite photos of where it is." A few images popped up on the screen, and they could kind of see what looked like some black metal pieces stuck in the ice. A map appeared next, and the images went over the map in a certain location. After that, Ezekiel's face appeared again as he said, "It took a while to rewrite all the coding for one of the CIA's spy satellites, but it can take highly detailed photos now. Too bad they think the satellite lost its orbit and burned up in the atmosphere. Their loss is our gain. I will send Sam the info on how to access it later." Ezekiel looked back at Fury and said, "I hope that is a good enough olive branch for now." Everyone was quiet, even Peggy and Hank, as they waited for Fury to answer. After a moment, he shook his head and said, "All of my experience is telling me not to trust you. We don't really know you at all, and you haven't told anyone what you want for our help. I've seen enough in this world to know that everything has a price. I want to know what the price is for all of this before I say yes to anything." Ezekiel smiled at that before he said, "I could tell you about myself, but my story is so unbelievable that you would assume I was crazy if I told you. Maybe when you actually trust me, I will tell you about it." Looking off to the side for a moment, Ezekiel started to speak again in a low voice and said, "You want to know what my price is, Fury? My price is people's lives." Looking back over the room once more, he took a moment to look at each person. When he was done, he locked eyes with Fury and said, "If I do nothing and just let the world progress as it should, I know 5 people in this room who will die when Hydra finally makes its move. But it's not just Hydra that I want to stop. I also know of other things that will happen: disasters, terrorist attacks. If I don't do something, those people's deaths are on me because I had the ability to help and I did nothing." Fury kept eye contact with Ezekiel for over a minute before he finally let out a sigh and said, "I still don't trust you, but I will work with you until you give me a reason not to. What do you propose we do? I assume you already have some type of plan formed?" "I have some ideas, but no concrete plans. My first idea was removing some of the people here from S.H.I.E.L.D. so we can work without having to worry about being watched by Hydra spies. Maria Hill, Phil Coulson, and yourself need to stay. But everyone else here is optional." Fury looked at the other 2 people in question and then asked, "I know why I need to stay in S.H.I.E.L.D., but why do Phil and Maria need to stay?" "Phil is your go-to for a lot of things in the future and runs point on some important things. Maria becomes your second in command later and is who takes over as director when you retire." Both Phil and Maria's eyes widen a little at that but say nothing. Looking around the room, Ezekiel spots a Hispanic-looking man with black hair that had a little bit of gray coming in. Once he locked eyes with the man, he said, "Robert Gonzalez, I would suggest that you retire for now. I know that between now and when Hydra makes their move in about 20 years, your wife passes away, and you leave S.H.I.E.L.D. for a few years because of that. But when you come back, you are a great asset to the organization and are one of the reasons S.H.I.E.L.D. didn't completely fall apart when Hydra attacked. I am sorry I can't give you more details, but that is all I really know about you." The man looked completely shocked, but just nodded his head in reply. The rest of the room stayed quiet for a moment before Ezekiel said, "I also have the names of a few people that aren't currently in S.H.I.E.L.D., but are supposed to join it in the future. I want them recruited here instead. It will increase our manpower with people we can trust. I will get it sent to you after we finish here. I will also send you over everything I have collected on Hydra and the currently known members. But I want to stress that this list is tiny compared to how many there are. They have people in every branch of government, military, private company, and other organizations that are important throughout the world. We cannot show our cards until we know all of them. Peggy spoke up at that and said, "How long do you think it will take? I could be as fast as a few years, or it could take me more than 10 years. A lot of Hydra leaders are very cautious, and it will take a while to figure out who they are. You also have to realize about 35% of S.H.I.E.L.D. is currently Hydra sleeper agents." Fury jumped out of his chair and yelled, "How the fuck is that much of S.H.I.E.L.D. compromised? When the people in power are already double agents, it's not hard to bring in more. It's actually pretty brilliant how they have done it honestly. But they also find people in S.H.I.E.L.D. who are susceptible to their way of thinking and recruit them from within. That is why we need to be cautious of our current actions and not alert them. We need to have the manpower to fight them properly. If we don't, it will turn into a protracted war and a lot of people will die." Fury started to slowly pace as he thought over what he learned. Ezekiel turned to look at Hank and said, "So Dr. Pym, after hearing all of this, would you like to join us?" Fury continued to pace, but also paid attention to Hank as he did. Most of the people in the room had listened to what Ezekiel had said and talked quietly amongst themselves for the past few minutes as they waited for his reply. Hank sat and thought for a while. Sometimes he glanced towards Peggy, then looked at someone else in the room for a moment. After a while, he finally looked at Ezekiel and said, "I will help, but my priority is to rescue my wife first. Once that is done, I will see about helping in a more hands-on way." Ezekiel smiled at that and said, "Glad to be working with you, Dr. Pym. Question for you. Have you finished your particle discs yet?" Hank looked a little shocked at first, but then calmly said, "Yes, I have. Why?" "I would like to recover the captain as soon as possible, and our group doesn't really have the manpower to do it currently. But if a couple of people went with a shrinking particle disc, we could recover him and the ship and be back within a day or so. Then we could return it to its normal size here and bring the captain out of his hibernation. I would just ask you to go, but I have something else I need you to do, and it also can't wait. So I am asking that you trust someone else with your tech." Hank was quiet for a while before he looked at Peggy and said, "I will trust Peggy with some particle discs." Peggy nodded her head in thanks to Hank. Hank looked back to the monitor screen and said, "Now what is it you need me to do?" "For a few weeks now, I have been hiding info about an explosion that happened in Argentina. I didn't want S.H.I.E.L.D. and more to the point Hydra finding out about it. There you will find your former colleague Bill Foster. He is currently taking care of a young girl named Ava Star. I am sure you can take a guess at who her parents were." Hank almost spit out the name Elihaz as he asked, "Elihaz and Catherine had a kid? Wait, are you saying they died?" "Yes, Elihaz was trying to make a quantum tunnel, but he cut too many corners and it ended up killing him and his wife. His daughter Ava got the worst of it. She is suffering from molecular disequilibrium." Almost everyone in the room looked confused except for Hank, who had a look of horror. It took him a minute before he asked, "Are you sure it's molecular disequilibrium?" Ezekiel shook his head sadly and said, "Yes. How is the poor girl still alive?" Before Ezekiel could reply, Coulson asked, "What exactly is molecular disequilibrium?" Ezekiel looked over to Coulson with a sad expression before he said, "The short answer is that every cell in her body is torn apart and then stitched back together. Over and over. Every day." Ezekiel looked over the group. Some people had a look of pity. Some looked horrified. Fury is the only one who seems disinterested. Ezekiel looks back at Hank and said, "If I did nothing, that girl would be taken in by S.H.I.E.L.D. for training. She would be promised a cure and then trained as an assassin and spy, since her molecular disequilibrium also gives her the ability to phase out of existence. A real-life ghost. The perfect assassin, honestly. But S.H.I.E.L.D. never finds a cure and honestly doesn't really try. Bill Foster is the only person who really tries to help her. But I think if you and Bill work together, you will have a better chance to cure her sooner, and it will also help you with researching the quantum realm. Also, you were looking at hiring a brilliant kid from MIT, Darren Cross, to be your protege, right?" Hank looked up at Ezekiel and said, "I was planning to make him a formal offer when he graduated." "Well, if you go through with it, I would be completely honest with him. The man is a genius and is able to make his own version of your tech without your help. But since you weren't honest with him about your tech in the first place and always denied it even existed while keeping him at a distance, he grew bitter towards you and ended up pushing you out of your own company. He became so obsessed with trying to surpass you that when you destroyed all of his research work on it, he tried to kill you. I would suggest bringing him onto the project to help rescue your wife and treat him like an equal. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. You can do as you wish." Hank just nodded in reply, but said nothing else. Ezekiel looked at another person in the room and said, "All right, next order of business. 00014. Who was the best?" The room was quiet. Only 3 people were inside. Everyone else had left after the meeting with Ezekiel was finished. Fury looked at the other 2 people with him. The first was his mentor, and the other a brilliant scientist. Peggy was the first to speak as she said, "Out with it, Fury. I want to know your thoughts." Fury looked at Hank and Peggy before he looked at the monitor Ezekiel had been using for the past few hours. He let out a sigh before he said, "If even a little bit of what he said is true, the world is in trouble. You think he was lying to us?" "No, Peggy, I don't, and that is the biggest issue. I think everything he told us was the truth as far as he knows. But he also gave us more information than he might have intended. Like when he asked Hank if he wanted to believe in magic. He mentioned someone, the Sorcerer Supreme, that he didn't want to deal with. We need to find this person, and hopefully they might know something about our new friend Ezekiel." "I agree. I think finding out more about him is our safest bet moving forward." "What about you, Hank?" Hank nodded his head and said, "I agree. We need to know more about him. Once we do, we can make a better determination about him and his character. But honestly, if he is right about even half of the stuff he talked about, I would rather have him on our side feeding us information." "Also, he talked about Inhumans. You think that means mutants?" Fury shook his head and said, "Doubtful. I am pretty sure he is talking about another group of powered people or another species altogether, since he said the one Hydra worshipped was sent to another world. Just another thing we will have to look into." "I agree, but first I need to go find Steve." "Hank, how soon can you bring me those particle discs?" Hank smiled and then pulled out a small pouch. He opened it up, and inside were some small silver discs. He held one up and said, "This one will shrink things down. The other colored one will enlarge them back to normal." After handing them over to Peggy, Hank stood up and said, "I am going to head out. I need to go find Bill and Ava." Hank turned and looked at Fury as he said, "Is there space here to set up a lab?" "There are a lot of areas that we haven't touched yet. I will have Sam start to wire one up for power. If there is any equipment you need, just send a list to Sam, and he will make sure you get it." Hank nodded his head and then walked out of the room. Fury turned to Peggy and said, "Who are you taking with you to go pick up Steve?" "I think your man Carlson will work. Can I borrow him for a few days?" "Sure, I can make a mission for him that will take a week or so. It shouldn't make anyone suspicious if he isn't around for a bit on a mission." Theo was sitting reading in the kitchen, while his father was cooking dinner, and his sister Emily, better known as Millie, was sitting next to him watching their father cook. After a few minutes, she looked at Theo and said, Theo, what are you doing?" Theo looked up from his book at his younger sister Millie. She had just started talking after her first birthday and would ask questions constantly now. Most of the time it was to learn new words, since her favorite thing to say is, "What is that called?" followed by, "Why?" Honestly, her curiosity about everything is kinda amazing. She almost gives Sam a run for his money when he was first created. "I am reading this new book Dad gave me." Millie tilted her head slightly to one side and asked, "Why? Is it fun?" Theo tilted his head the same way as Millie and asked, "Do I ever do anything not fun?" "Yes." Theo's eyes widened for a second as he heard his father laugh a little. Theo then asked, "What? When?" Millie turned and looked at the ceiling. Her face scrunched up as she thought for a minute. His father turned around and watched for a moment. Millie's face relaxed as she looked back at Theo and said, "Always." His father started laughing hard at that and then asked, "Millie, what about Daddy? Is Daddy fun?" Millie put her hands up and said, "Daddy is the best." His father laughed again at that and asked, "What about Mommy?" "Daddy is the best." Theo looked at his father as he laughed and then looked back at Millie and asked, "What about your big brother? Didn't you say I was the best when we were at Aunt May's?" Millie looked at him for a moment before she looked away with her lips slightly pushed out and said, "Daddy wasn't there. So I am only the best when Dad isn't around?" Millie had her eyes closed and lips pushed out slightly as she nodded yes. His father laughed again at that, and Theo just shook his head at her response. Theo then picked his book back up and went back to reading as his father started to sing and Millie tried to copy him. It wasn't long before everyone heard the front door open and someone said, "Whatever you are cooking smells amazing." After a few moments, Theo's mother entered the kitchen and went straight to Millie, picked her up and gave her a hug and some kisses as she asked, "Did Millie miss Mommy?" "Yes. Mommy is the best." "You hear that, honey? I am the best." Theo's father smiled and asked, "Millie, who is the best?" "Mommy is the best." Theo's father turned around and looked shocked as he asked, "But didn't you just say I was the best before Mommy came home?" Millie looked at her dad and stated matter-of-factly, "Mommy wasn't home." Theo laughed at that and said, "Looks like you are only the best if Mom isn't around and I am only the best if Mom and you aren't around." Millie nodded at that and said, "Mommy is best." Theo's mom laughed at that as she seated Millie back down. She reached over and rubbed Theo's hair before she grabbed his book and set it to the side as she said, "Dinner time. You can read after we are done, sweetie." Theo's mother gave her husband a hug and a kiss before she started to set the table as he finished cooking dinner. It wasn't long before both of them joined their kids at the table and began to eat the delicious chicken Alfredo that Jacob cooked. Theo's mother leaned over and kissed his father after her first bite and said, "Great as always, honey." Theo nodded his head and said, "I still like tacos more, but this is pretty good." Millie had a small plate in front of her, and the bottom half of her face was covered in sauce as she said, "Pizza is the best." Theo's father smiled at the compliments as his wife reached over with a napkin and cleaned Millie's face up as she asked, "How come you make a mess every time you eat?" Theo laughed and said, "It's a skill she practices every day." His father laughed, and his mother shot him a quick glare at his comment. Millie sucked another noodle into her mouth, and it hit the side of her face before she finished. Her cheek now had sauce on it again. Theo laughed and said, "See, it's a skill she practices." His mother just shook her head as his father laughed again. Dinner finished shortly after, and Theo moved to the couch with his book. His mother sat next to him with Millie seated on her lap and asked, "So how was your day at Aunt May's?" Before Theo responded, Millie spoke up and replied, "It was fun. Peter and Teo climbed to the top of the bookcase." Theo's mother looked at him with a blank face and asked with a calm voice, "So you climbed to the top of the bookcase today? I distinctly remember asking you not to climb things anymore." Theo looked betrayed as he said, "You asked me to do it and said you wouldn't tell Mom if I could climb all the way to the top." Millie nodded her head in understanding and then looked at her mom and said, "Teo didn't climb to the top of the bookcase." Theo dropped his head into both of his hands and shook his head back and forth. His mother laughed as she hugged Millie and said, "Okay, Millie, so Theo didn't climb to the top of the bookcase today. What did he do then?" "He climbed the tree. It was better than when he climbed the bookcase." "You are not helping." Theo's mother smacked the back of his head and said, "Not only did you climb the bookcase, but you were climbing the tree in May's backyard? What if you fell and got hurt? What if Peter copied you and started to climb the tree?" Millie looked up at her mom and said, "Peter climbed the tree too. It was great." Theo's mother smacked the back of his head again and said, "You are setting a bad example for Peter. If you keep this up, Millie might start climbing stuff also." Theo looked over at his sister, but it was already too late as she said, "Teo taught me to climb the couch today." Theo's face fell as he looked up at his mother's disappointed face. She pulled Millie into a tighter hug and said, "You are Millie's older brother. You are supposed to watch over her and make sure she doesn't get hurt. So why are you teaching her how to climb things? Things she could fall from and get hurt?" Theo waited a few moments before he said, "I can't say no when she starts to ask in her cute voice." Theo's dad had just walked into the room and started to laugh before he said, in Theo's defense, "You can't really say no when Millie asks you for something in her cute voice either. But I am not teaching Millie how to climb things. I just give her treats. And I've said climbing stuff is fine. Once they get hurt, they will know not to do it." Theo's mom shook her head and said, "But I don't want them to get hurt. I want them to be safe." Theo's dad sat down and put one arm around his wife as he said, "It's gonna happen one way or another at some point. I know they are both young, but you need to prepare now. I still want them safe and healthy, but I also know Theo is gonna climb everything he can." Theo's dad looked at him and said, No new books for a week since you didn't listen to your mom. Theo just looked down again and said, I understand. Sorry. Theo's dad looked down at Millie and said, and you young lady, you don't get any treats for a week for asking your brother to do stuff he shouldn't be doing. Millie started to tear up a little and looked up at her mom and asked in her cute voice, Mommy, I can have treats, right? Her mom looked like she wanted to say yes, but a gentle squeeze on her shoulder and a single shake of her husband's head was all she needed. She looked down at her daughter and said, Sorry, sweetie, your father said no treats for a week? Millie looked at her father and said, Mommy is still the best, before she turned her head around and puffed out her cheeks as she looked the other way. 00015. Collecting the pieces, looking at the familiar shield encased in ice, her heart sped up a little. She had spent the last day traveling here with a faint hope in her heart. The last hour getting inside the Valkyrie was the worst part, but she had to make sure that Steve was in here. She crouched down and wiped a layer of frost off the piece of ice in front of her. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw Steve's head encased in the ice. A face she hadn't seen in almost 60 years. A single tear started to form, and before it could roll down her cheek it froze almost where it started. She stood up, wiped the tear away, and then looked at the man who had joined her on this trip. He stood in awe as he looked down at Steve encased inside the ice. After a moment, he looked back up at her and said, I am ready whenever you are, ma'am. Peggy nodded her head in confirmation before they both made their way back outside of the plane. It wasn't exactly what she remembered, but then again most of it was encased in the ice. Only a few parts of the giant black plane were exposed to the world. Most of it was hidden under the ice. Not wanting to waste time, she pulled out one of the shrinking discs, pushed the button, and threw it at the wingtip in front of her. A second later and the wing and plane were gone. But on the ground in front of her was what looked like a broken-foot-long toy plane. She looked over at Carlson. He stepped beside it and picked it up. It didn't take them long to load it inside an ice chest that they prepared beforehand. They wanted to make sure they were back in base and the Valkyrie was its normal size before they pulled Steve out and began to thaw everything. Once they were done, they boarded their transport and headed back to base. To say that Bill Foster was stunned would be the understatement of a lifetime. A man who he never thought he would meet again had shown up at his hotel room in Argentina. After Bill answered the door, the man not only greeted him with an apology, but gave him a hug and asked if they could talk. Still in shock, he invited the man inside where they were now seated. Bill looked at his old friend and still didn't know what to say. Hank looked around the room for a few moments before he locked eyes with Bill and said, Bill, I really am sorry for how I treated you. When I lost Janet, I didn't handle it well at all. I lashed out at everyone close to me, and I really want to say that I am truly sorry for my actions. You were a great friend, and you didn't deserve to be treated like that. Bill sat in silence for a while as he examined the man in front of him. The sadness in the man's eyes was still there, but the anger that used to be there was gone and replaced with what looked like a spark of hope. Bill reached over, placed his hand on the man's shoulder and said, Hank, I forgive you. I might have acted the same way if I was in your position. Hank nodded his head in response, but didn't say anything else. Bill studied him for a moment longer before he removed his hand, sat back in his seat, and asked, How did you even find me, by the way? Hank laughed for a moment before he said, Honestly, I don't even believe it myself, but someone told me that you were here and that you were taking care of Elias Starr's daughter Ava, who was suffering from molecular disequilibrium. Bill stood up shocked as he looked down at Hank. After a moment, he looked at a closed door across the room. Hank glanced at the door but said nothing as he waited for Bill. Bill sat down defeated after a few seconds. His gaze never left the door as he asked, When did you go back to S.H.I.E.L.D.? Actually, it doesn't really matter anyways. If S.H.I.E.L.D. gets their hands on Ava, they will use her and turn that girl into a weapon. I don't want that to happen, but I don't have the resources to help her myself. Bill lowered his head and looked at his hands in defeat. Hank reached out and patted Bill on the shoulder as he said, You know, Ezekiel said the same thing. That is one of the reasons he sent me to find you and Ava. Bill looked up at Hank and asked, Ezekiel? Does he work for S.H.I.E.L.D.? Hank shook his head and said, Not really. He is working with people from S.H.I.E.L.D., but he is not part of it. Bill had a little spark of hope in his eyes as he asked, So you came to find me and Ava for this man Ezekiel? What was the other reason you came for? Hank's eyes shimmered as he smiled, before he said, Janet is alive, and I need your help to rescue her. Ezekiel said that by helping destabilize Ava, it will also help us in finding a way to get Janet back. Or at least that is what he believes. Bill looked at his friend in shock. His lower jaw dropped open for a second before it snapped closed and he asked, Janet is still alive? I mean, I know you had theories on what could happen if someone goes quantum, but it was all guesswork. Hank nodded his head and then said, I've thought about it for years, but at this point I didn't think it would matter even if I made something to go into the quantum realm. Then what happened? What changed? Ezekiel. Bill looked confused as he asked, Ezekiel? You said his name, but why is he so important? Hank shook his head as he said, I can't tell you here, but if you come and join us, I will tell you everything. Bill looked back at the door for a while before he asked, You are going to help me cure Ava? Yes, I would still help Ava even if you don't join us. Bill stood up, and as he did, he reached over and offered his right hand to Hank. Hank took it with his own right hand and was pulled up by Bill. With their hands still clasped together, Bill shook Hank's hand and said, It's good to be working with you again, old friend. Hank smiled a little at that and pulled Bill into a quick hug as he said, Same to you, Bill. After their hands released, Bill looked over towards the door and Hank followed his gaze. After a second, Hank thought he saw something, but couldn't make out what it was. It wasn't until Bill said, Ava, honey, it's not polite to eavesdrop on people. The next second, a young girl's ghostly head came out of the door. She looked a little embarrassed at Bill and said in a meek tone of voice, Sorry. It's fine, Ava. Come here, please. I want you to meet someone who is going to help me find a way to cure you. The ghost girl, who looked no older than 13 years old, walked fully through the door, but the door was still mostly visible behind her. She had on some light pink pajamas. In her hands was a little white teddy bear she clutched tightly to her chest. Her head dropped slightly as she walked closer to Bill and Hank. She would flicker in and out of existence, sometimes completely solid. Other times she disappeared completely and would be closer the next time she reappeared. She finally stopped when she was next to Bill but did nothing else. Bill reached down and gently touched Ava's head as she became completely solid again. He looked down at the girl with a hint of sadness in his eyes as he said, Ava, honey, this is Hank Pym. He is the smartest man I have ever met, and he is going to help me with finding a way to cure you. She kept her head down as she said, Daddy said Hank Pym is an asshole and that he hated him. Hank kneeled down next to Ava and said, He wasn't wrong. Me and your father used to work together. We were friends, but he tried to do something that upset me greatly. In return, I did everything I could to do the same to him. Unfortunately, because of that, I am an indirect cause of why you are suffering and your parents are no longer here. Ava finally looked up at Hank. There was a little bit of anger in her eyes, but they were also filled with a deep sadness. She looked like she wanted to say something, but then she started to tear up. She turned her head away and started to cry. As she did, her body phased in and out of existence. Bill was the first to react, and he knelt down next to her and said, Ava, honey, I know it's hard, but please concentrate. You need to settle down and concentrate, or it will just hurt more. It took about a minute, but she finally calmed down and became mostly solid again. Bill pulled her into a hug after that and just held her in silence for a while as Hank watched. When Bill finally released her from the hug, Hank reached out slowly. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder and asked, Ava, will you let me help find a way to cure you? Ava looked at Bill, who smiled at her, before she looked at Hank and nodded her head yes in reply. Hank removed his hand as he stood up. He then looked at both Bill and Ava and said, Let's get you both packed. I have a place where we can work. We just need to make one stop before we go there. Bill stood up with his arm around Ava's shoulder as he asked, Where do you need to stop at, and where is our workspace at? The workspace is a secret base I can't really tell you the location of, but the stop is so we can pick up Hope. She is a little older than Ava, but I think Ava could use a friend while she is with us at the base. Bill smiled at that and said, That is a great idea, but is that going to be allowed? Doesn't matter if they like it or not. I am working with them, not for them. Bill just nodded his head and said, We are pretty much ready to leave now. I had planned to leave here later today, so we are almost fully packed up already. Ava, can you change out of your pajamas and we will leave after that? Ava nodded her head in response, and then walked into the next room by going through the wall. Fury shook his head again as he looked at the list in front of him. 3 names stood out the most to him, mostly because they are the names of kids: Eric Stevens, Grant Ward, and Mary Sue Poots. But next to that was Ezekiel's reason for finding them and trying to recruit them. He memorized where to find them before he closed the document and then shut off his connection to Ezekiel's hidden network. He let out a sigh as he stood up from his seat. He knew he couldn't trust anyone else with this task besides maybe Peggy or possibly Coulson. But he also knew she would be busy with Steve for a while, and Coulson couldn't disappear for too long. 00016. The Sweet Bully. Peggy watched quietly as Steve slept. It had been almost a week since she had found him, and they had taken their time as they thawed him out of the ice. They also had to find some doctors they trusted to bring into this new hidden faction they were making. The man Ezekiel had thought ahead and included some doctors into the list of people we should recruit. Of course, no one was told about Hydra. Only the original people from the first meeting knew our real purpose. Steve stirred slowly awake as he opened his eyes. Peggy reached over and held his hand gently as she said, "Hey, sleepyhead, you missed our date?" His eyes fully opened, and he took in the strange room around him for a second before he turned to look at the familiar voice he just heard. He started to smile, but then froze in place as he looked at the woman who just spoke. She looked like Peggy Carter, but she was older, more mature with some slight wrinkles and streaks for gray in her hair. The woman smiled bitterly as she said, "You were asleep a long time, Steve, almost 60 years. Steve sat up and pulled Peggy into a hug as he said softly, "Sorry I wasn't there for you." She said nothing back but hugged him a little tighter. They stayed like that for a while, just being held by each other in silence. After an unknown amount of time passed, someone knocked on the door. After another minute, they reluctantly released each other before Peggy said, "Yes. What is it?" The door opened and Sam stepped inside. He glanced first at Steve before he looked at Peggy and said, "Sorry to interrupt you, ma'am, but the doctors wanted to run a few tests now that Steve is awake. They want to make sure his hibernation didn't have any negative effects." Peggy looked back at Steve and asked, "Feel like getting poked and prodded by a few doctors?" Steve swung his legs off the bed and stood up. He reached over to help Peggy out of her chair and said, "As long as you join me and start telling me about what I missed while I was asleep." She took his hand in hers and said, "It would be my pleasure." Theo's shadow clone connected to his hidden server and started looking over all the new updates he had received. Most of them were just stuff his program was looking for, signs of important Marvel characters he knew of. The rest were updates from the people in the new organization that he had worked to set up. While they didn't actually send him updates, his program watched everyone through their digital trail, cameras, and microphones on phones. It still missed things, like handwritten messages or notes and conversations where no electronics were around. He already had a plan to fix that gap at some point, as he could never be too careful in the new world he was in. After he finished checking the server, he logged off of it and opened up the newest program he was working on. Theo had a few ideas on how to make money, and one of them was starting a software business, something that he had already done in his last life, so it shouldn't be too much work for him to do it again. He already had the coding memorized for a few of the best products he released. He also planned to launch a few other things that this world doesn't have yet. He wasn't sure if they would have it in the first place, but just to be sure he would be launching them early. He needed as much information as possible, and the easiest way to do that was to make smartphones and start social media before anyone else. Once he had a phone in everyone's hands, not much would be able to escape his reach. Wait, am I actually turning into a villain? The clone shook its head. That was something that the real Theo could worry about. He just had to code this first program and then get it released to the public. Everything else could come after that. Theo was seated on the couch in May's living room with a new book in hand. His dad had made a habit. He stopped by the library on his way to work every few days and picked up a new book or two for Theo. They were always pretty simple kid books, but Theo never complained. It was the thought that counted, and he loved his dad for that. But he didn't waste them either. He would use them to teach Peter and Millie. Sometimes, Jean and MJ would join them to learn, but Millie stuck to Theo like glue whenever he taught Peter. The girls didn't seem to like learning as much as Peter or Millie, but they were already more advanced than most of the older kids who May watched. Kindergarten will be an interesting experience for sure, since May's was most likely going to be Theo's preschool. Uncle Ben opened the front door and said, "Honey, I am home." May looked out into the living room and said, "Welcome back, dear." Ben smiled and started to walk upstairs as he said, "I gotta clean up. I will be down in a bit." Theo closed the book in his hands. He had just received the memories from his clone and took a minute to process them. His clones were starting to cut it close when they despawned. But everything had proceeded correctly so far. Everyone on his list had been found and actually recruited. He was a little surprised at that. He didn't think everyone would say yes. Only the kids and a handful of people were allowed to go to the base for now. Fury had set up another site for the rest of the members he recruited. It was another decommissioned base that had been abandoned and its location and records completely removed from everything. It would be bare bones for now, but they would build it up together with some help from Sam and a few other people. Theo climbed down from the couch and went to Millie, who had been playing with Peter, MJ, and Jean. She looked at Theo and asked, "Theo, you done reading? You want to play with us?" Theo shook his head, pointed towards the clock, and said, "Dad is going to pick us up soon. I want you to clean up your mess before he gets here." Millie looked at the toys spread around them and the doll in her hand. She looked back at Theo and asked, "But we are still playing?" "I know, but what does it mean if Dad is almost here?" Millie tilted her head to the side and asked, "We will go home?" I am not sure if she acts like this because she is a kid or because it's fun. She is pretty smart, so I wouldn't put it past her. Theo let out a sigh and said, "Yes, we will go home. But it also means that almost everyone else will be going home soon too." Peter nodded at that and started to pick up the toys around him. MJ followed suit, followed by Jean and finally Millie. Theo had set his book down and also helped put the toys away. They actually went around the living room and picked up all the toys not being used. It was a habit that Theo had developed with him and the other kids. Once some of the other kids noticed Theo and his group had started to pick up toys, they joined in. It wasn't long before everything was cleaned up and put away correctly in the spare bedroom May used as toy storage for the kids. Before they could finish, someone knocked at the door. May opened it to let in MJ's dad. He was dressed in a standard NYC officer's uniform. He reached out his hand and said, "Great to see you, May. I came by to pick up Mary." May shook his hand and said, "James, it's good to see you again. How long has it been? A month? Almost. My new position has been keeping me busy, but I was able to get off early today, so I thought I would pick up MJ myself and say hello." Theo and his group had just walked back into the living room and saw MJ's dad. MJ ran past everyone else and put her arms up as she said, "Daddy." James laughed as he reached down and picked up MJ into his arms and asked, "How was your day, sweetie?" "Great. I like coming to Aunt May's." He rubbed the top of her head and said, "That's good to hear, sweetie. We are gonna head home. So what do you say to May?" MJ turned and looked at May as she said, "Thanks for having me over, Aunt May." May smiled and said, "It was a pleasure to have you. I will see you next week on Monday." "Thanks again, May. Always a pleasure to help out, James." James set MJ down and started to walk outside with her as someone said, "James, it's good to see you. It's been almost a month, hasn't it?" "Yes, it has, Jacob. It's good to see you also." Both men shook hands for a moment before James said, "I should have some time coming up around Christmas, so I can make it to the holiday party and we can catch up." "Sounds good. I will see you then." Jacob walked inside and gave May a quick hug as he said, "Good to see you, May. How have the Rugrats been today?" May lightly smacked Jacob and said, "Perfectly behaved like always." Millie was the first to react as she ran towards Jacob with her hands raised and said, "Daddy." Jacob reached down and picked Millie up as he asked, "How was your day, honey?" "Great. May made cookies. Theo and Peter gave me their cookies." Jacob smiled at that and then looked over to Theo, who just walked up next to them, and asked, "She didn't bully you both into giving her the cookies, did she?" Theo shook his head and said, "I didn't really want it in the first place. Sweets aren't that great." Peter wasn't bullied though, but he also can't say no to Millie's cute attack. May and Jacob both looked at each other a little shocked, before Jacob turned to Theo and asked, "You don't like sweets? Since when?" "Always, I guess. You just never asked. But you would always eat them whenever we gave you something sweet." Theo nodded his head at that and said, "I thought it would be rude if I refused to eat it." Jacob let out a sigh as he said, "This kid. I swear you don't act like a kid most of the time." May nodded in agreement but then asked, "So you don't like my pancakes, Theo?" "No, those are great. I just don't really care for things like candy, cake, cookies, muffins, ice cream, stuff like that." Millie replied, "Millie will eat all of Teo's candy, ice cream, cake, cookies, and muffins from now on." Jacob patted Millie's head and said, "We will see. I think me and May will just start making a little less, since Theo doesn't seem to like it." May shook her head and said, "Sounds like a plan to me." Millie waved her hands around and said, "But Millie can eat the extra." Jacob and May laughed at that, before Jacob reached up and pinched Millie's cheek and said, "If you eat too many sweet things, it's bad for you. You are also grounded from sweets for the next week since you took and ate Peter's cookie." Millie puffed out her cheeks at that and then turned away from Jacob. He just laughed and said, "Your actions have consequences, Millie. As much as you like sweets, don't force others to give you them. It's not a nice thing to do." Millie just kept looking the other way from her dad. Theo and May both shook their heads before Jacob said, "All right, let's head home and make dinner." "It was good to see you, May. Have a good night." "You too, Jacob." As Theo walked back to his house with his father and Millie, he asked, "Dad, I finished this book. Could I pick out the next book myself?" Jacob reached down and patted Theo's head as he said, "I don't see why not. You might not be old enough for a library card yet, but I see no reason why I can't take you this weekend to pick out a book or two." Millie finally turned and looked at her dad as she asked, "Millie can come too, right?" "Oh, you are done ignoring your father now?" Millie realized she messed up and turned away from her father again as she puffed out her cheeks. He laughed at her antics and said, "I was planning to bring you and Mommy along with us." Millie just nodded like it made sense, but never turned back around and looked at her father. She was still trying to punish him for taking away sweets for a week. 00017. The library and talking with the cap. Theo looked up at the building in front of him. He had passed it once before when he went to his father's work, but he didn't know what it was at the time since he didn't see the sign that read, "Steve Rogers Brooklyn Memorial Library." Theo pointed at the sign and asked, "Who is Steve Rogers Brooklyn? Does he own the library?" His mother and father laughed for a moment before his dad said, "Brooklyn is where we are, and Steve Rogers was an important person in history. He did some very good things a long time ago. So this library was named after him." Millie nodded her head like she already knew as her dad talked. Theo looked from the sign to his dad and asked, "Can I find books about Steve Rogers inside?" Jacob reached down and put his hand on Theo's shoulder and said, "You can, but wait till you are older to read them. They will be hard to understand for you right now. Actually, if you really want to know about Steve, I can give you my father's journals. He was a friend of his. They did a lot of things together when he was still in the military." Theo nodded his head and then said, "Sounds fun, but I still need new books today, and you said I could choose them myself?" "Yup, but I also told Millie she can pick a book if she wants one." Millie nodded at that and said, "Millie gets a book too, but Teo needs to read it to me." Theo shook his head but said nothing else as he walked inside with his parents and sister. Inside the front door was a bronze statue of Steve Rogers in his iconic gear, which included his shield. Theo stopped and looked at it for a few seconds before he followed his parents around the display and to the front desk. Next to the right side of the desk were some turnstiles that allowed entry into the library proper. On the left side of the desk were some exit turnstiles and a checkout counter for books. Jacob reached down and picked up Theo. As he did, he said, "Agnes, I want you to meet your newest member." A slightly older woman looked up from the book she was reading and glanced at Jacob for a second before she looked at Theo. After a moment, she said, "So this is your son you keep bragging about, the one who reads the books you give him in a day?" Jacob smiled and said, "The one and only." Theo glanced at the woman's nameplate for a second and then looked back at her as he said, "Hello. My name is Theodore Ezekiel Mercer, and it's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Steelwell." "Oh, he has manners too. Are you sure he is your son?" Jacob laughed at that, then pointed at his wife as he said, "I am pretty sure he gets that from his mom. You remember Daniel?" "Of course I do. You are even more radiant than the first time I met you, dear." Daniel smiled at that and said, "It's good to see you again, Agnes." Agnes nodded in reply and then looked at Millie and said, "And this must be your daughter Emily you keep talking about." Millie shook her head and said, "No, my name is Millie." "Oh, I am sorry, sweetie. I must have misheard your father when he told me your name. Millie nodded her head and said, It's okay, now you know. Theo, along with his mother and father, laughed a little at that as Agnes said, Well, I know who takes after Jacob. So, Jacob, are you here to get Theo some more books? That is the plan, but I promised him that I would let him pick out whatever he wants. Agnes nodded her head at that and asked, Were you planning to get him his own library card? Theo glanced at his dad before he looked back to Agnes and excitedly asked, Am I even allowed to have one? You are polite and enjoy reading. I have no issue with setting up a card for you. But you can only check out books if you come here with one of your parents. Theo looked at his dad and asked, Can I please get a library card, Dad? Millie looked at her mom and said, Millie wants a card too. Jacob glanced at Theo and then Millie before he looked at Agnes and said, One card for Theo, please. He looked over to Millie and said, If you get a library card, then you have to read the books yourself. Theo won't be able to read them to you. Do you still want one? Millie looked conflicted for a second before she shook her head and said, No, Millie likes when Theo reads to her. Jacob reached over and patted Millie's head while Agnes started to work on a library card for Theo. It only took a couple of minutes and a few questions and Theo was handed his very own library card. After that, they walked inside and Theo's parents took them to the kids section of books. Theo spent a little while looking around and didn't really find anything he liked. He did find one book for Millie about dragons and fairies. He gave up on the kids section and started to look around next to it. His parents were nice and let him roam around the area alone, but he was always in sight of one of them. After a bit of looking around, he found the how to section just a couple rows over from the kid books and started to look around it. It didn't take long to find two books he wanted. One of them was a beginner's guide to art and drawing. The other book was a beginner's guide to programming. He was pretty sure he could get away with the first book. The second one, he wasn't sure if his parents would let him get it. But he planned to try. They did say he could pick anything he wanted. Theo carried the books back to his parents and said, I want these. They look fun. His parents both looked at the books and both had different expressions. His father looked a little confused and his mother looked a little curious. His father spoke first and asked, Why did you pick these two books? Theo pointed at the first book and said, I like to draw. This says it can teach me to draw cool things. He opened up the next book and pointed at some text as he said, I am not really sure what programming is, but it says here that you can learn to make games if you learn this whole book. I like games. It might be fun to make my own game. Jacob nodded his head a bit and then looked at his wife and asked, I did tell him he could pick whatever he wanted. What do you think, honey? She smiled and said, He has always been a little different. I don't mind if he wants these books. She looked at Theo and said, Programming is something you use a computer to do. Once you read the first few chapters of the book and can explain it to me, then I will let you use the computer to practice programming. Do we have a deal? Theo nodded his head and said, Yes, mother. Good, now let's head home. Steve was seated in a conference room next to Peggy. A few other people he had been introduced to were with him. Director Fury, Agent Coulson, Dr. Pym, and Maria Hill. They were waiting for the last person to arrive before they started. It wasn't long before the wall monitor came on and a man with black hair and eyes appeared. He spoke as soon as he appeared and said, I am glad you could all make it. Fury spoke next and said, Seems like you didn't want to come in person again. I unfortunately will not be able to show up in person for a while, but I promise I will make it there when I can. Before Fury could reply, Steve spoke up and said, I want to thank you for telling Peggy how to find me. I really appreciate it. You are welcome, Cap. They would have found you themselves in about 20 years, but we have a lot of things we need to deal with, and you being on ice was not going to help anyone. Steve nodded his head and said, Well, you still have my thanks, Ezekiel, but I assume you didn't call us here just for that, right? You were right. I came to discuss a few things. A few of them involve you, and a few involve Project Tahiti. Fury stood up and slammed his hands on the desk as he said, That is beyond top secret. How do you even know about that? Hello. I said I could see the future. Fury shook his head as he sat down and said, Still doesn't answer the question. Ezekiel smiled at that and said, I know, but it's the best one I can give you. Anyways, Coulson, where are you on the project? Have any of the subjects started to display weird compulsions to draw random symbols? Coulson looked at Fury, who let out a sigh and nodded his head. He then looked at Ezekiel and said, 3 of the subjects have started to draw the strange symbols, and we haven't figured out a way to stop it. I was going to recommend canceling the project if we can't find a way to fix the issue." Ezekiel nodded his head for a second and then said, "What they are trying to make is a 3D model of a city. I would recommend letting them use things to make a 3D model of the symbols. After they see it once, the symptoms will stop and the test subjects will be fine. I would still monitor them for a while afterwards, and I will also need to confirm that they aren't Hydra sleeper agents. But after that, I think we should bring them into our new group." Coulson and Fury both looked at each other for a few moments before Coulson nodded and then looked at Ezekiel and said, "Thank you for the advice. I will test it out when I get back." "Great, and don't forget to send me the names of each one so I can start checking out their backgrounds." Ezekiel looked over to Steve and said, "Cap, I have a few things I would like you to do. The first is to start weight training." Everyone looked a little confused at the request, and Steve asked, "Didn't the serum I took make me the peak of what a human can be?" "Yes, but you are no longer human like the people in the room with you. You can train and become even stronger than your current self. It was never brought up before because you were in the war and no one thought about it. But trust me, Cap, you can become even stronger, and honestly, for what is coming, we will need you at your best." Steve nodded his head at that and then asked, "What else do you need me to do?" A picture appeared on the screen. It was Steve with the Howling Commandos. 2 people on it were circled. Then a picture changed and a photo of each man was put up on the screen. After a moment, Ezekiel reappeared on the screen with the photos to each side of his face as he asked, "I am sure you know who these men are?" Steve said in a slightly pained voice, "Of course, that's Bucky and Logan. Why are you showing me their pictures?" The pictures changed. Both were newer and in color. One showed a gruff man with a cigar, talking with a bald man in a wheelchair. The other picture was a man with a metal arm and long black hair strapped into a chair with wires attached to him. Ezekiel then said, "What if I told you they are both still alive?" Steve was almost shaking in his seat as he looked at the picture of Bucky. He kept looking at the photo as he asked, "How is Bucky still alive?" 00018. Timelines, how do they work? He survived the fall into the canyon but lost his arm. Hydra saved him and gave him some type of super soldier serum, replaced his arm, and brainwashed him into the perfect killer. He is now called the Winter Soldier. Are you fucking kidding me? Bucky Barnes, Captain America's best friend, is the Winter Soldier? Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Seems like just the type of thing a group like Hydra would do. Why are you surprised, Fury?" Fury shook his head, but said nothing else. Steve finally looked at Ezekiel and asked, "How is he still alive?" "They kept him frozen most of the time and only brought him out to kill a target, then they would freeze him again. As far as I know, his last target was Howard Stark on December 16th, 1991. No one spoke for a while until Peggy asked, "Why did Hydra send Bucky to kill Howard?" Howard had completed what he thought was the super soldier serum. Hydra wanted it. Turns out it wasn't perfect and made the test subjects mentally unstable. So they put them all on ice at a secret facility in Russia. I think Bucky is still there, since his handler is in charge of that base. Peggy asked, "Howard really finished it?" Steve stood up at the same time and asked, "Do you know where the base is? We need to rescue him." Ezekiel shook his head and said, "Like I said, he thought he completed it, but it had issues. As for the base, I currently don't know its location, but it doesn't matter anyways. We don't have the manpower to take that base currently, but I have an idea on how we might be able to. I am just concerned if us taking that base will raise any flags within Hydra, unless we place the blame firmly on someone else." Steve started to pace back and forth next to the desk as he said, "We can't leave Bucky with them. I don't want my friend to suffer under them any more than he already has." "I understand your concerns, Cap, but we need to be careful. Playing with the timeline can lead to worse outcomes than what I am trying to prevent, and the more we mess with it, the worse it can get." Fury spoke up and said, "But you said you can see the future. Can't you just see what is going to happen once you change something?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, I can't. I had a pretty good idea what was going to happen to this universe before I was born. But since I was born, the timeline has been changing, and I don't know how it's going to affect the future. So I figured if it's already different, I might as well change it more, and when an important event happens, I will intervene to make it end better than it would." Everyone stayed quiet as they thought over what Ezekiel had said. Steve was the first to speak as he asked, "So you had an idea of what would happen. But since you have been changing things, you aren't really sure what will actually happen anymore and are hoping things stay the same anyways so you can change it? Am I the only one who is confused?" Everyone, except for Hank, glanced at each other and kinda shrugged before they looked back at Ezekiel and waited for an answer. Yes and no. I guess Dr. Pym is the only one who has an idea what I meant. Hank nodded and said, "I think you are talking about multiverse theory?" That is correct, but it's also different. Here, let me give everyone some simple examples. Ezekiel's face shrunk down and a horizontal green line appeared on a black background on the display. As it did, he started to speak and said, "Take this here as our current timeline, except that I was never born. But I want you to keep in mind this line is actually millions upon millions of timelines that are similar. Everything in them happens the exact same, till something doesn't. Another line branches off from it and moves parallel to it. Now this new branch is where I was born. But this is also millions upon millions of timelines also, and each one is the exact same until another branch breaks off from the second line, and it begins to run parallel to the first and second line. This third branch is where I decided to actively interfere in the timeline, kinda where we are now. Now this one is the same as the others, millions upon millions of timelines, and each one is the exact same. Under that timeline the words appear, 'You are here, laughing face.' Another branch breaks off from the third line, and it begins to run parallel to the other three lines. This is one where I didn't tell you about Bucky, but still decided to interfere in the timeline. Another branch breaks off from the fourth line, and it begins to run parallel to the other four lines. Now in this one I don't tell you what I know about certain future events. As you can see, whenever I do something it will affect the timeline and make a new branch. Another branch breaks off from the fifth line, and it begins to run parallel to the other five lines. But in this timeline, Fury took the info I gave him and decided to act against Hydra earlier than I planned to and fucked my plans up. It's not just me who can branch the timeline. Anyone who gains knowledge from me and makes a decision they wouldn't make without that knowledge can branch the timeline." Ezekiel looked at everyone in the room and asked, "Everyone is with me so far, right?" Everyone nodded in reply. Ezekiel smiled and a red vertical line showed up running across and touching each of the green lines. Now these red lines are events that happen in almost every timeline. It doesn't matter what I change in the timeline, the event is going to happen. Let's call them acts of fate. If the whole universe wants something to happen, it will happen. It might be completely different in each timeline branch, but it still happens. A good example of this would be you, Captain Rogers. In most of the multiverse, you are almost always Captain America. Hank shook his head and said, "I refuse to believe in something like fate. It would make our free will meaningless." Other people nodded their heads at that as Ezekiel laughed and said, "I said call them acts of fate, but it's not really fate. Let's take the example I gave about Captain Rogers. The reason he is almost always Captain America is because of the choices he makes in each life that leads to it happening. If he makes different choices, then it doesn't happen. But someone else will step in to take the mantle in his place, causing a new timeline branch. But that red line event still happened, because the universe wanted it. Everyone still with me? If this red line event is supposed to happen some way or another, then what about people who are supposed to die? You are trying to change things because you want to save people. But won't these people still die? Or just different people in their place instead? Honestly, that is a very good question, Peggy. I don't think individual people's deaths count as a red line event. Red line events are normally things that can shape history or change the world or even the universe. I know the aspect of death might be a little upset if I save people who were supposed to die, but I am not bringing them back to life, so I doubt they would really care much at all. Which reminds me, don't go overboard with Project Tahiti. That could really cause some issues. Coulson raised his hand and asked, "What do you mean by aspect of death?" Ezekiel let out a sigh and said, "You can kind of think of them like a god, with a capital G. You know, this would be so much easier if you were versed in magic, then I wouldn't have to explain much of this at all." Around one of the empty chairs at the table, the area around it started to shatter like a mirror, and after a few seconds a woman with a bald head and wearing robes was seated there. Everyone reacted to her presence and pulled out weapons, going on the defensive. except for Fury, who just had a smug smile on his face as he looked at Ezekiel. Ezekiel studied the woman for a few moments before he said, I didn't expect to meet you for a while, Ancient One. Although I was kinda hoping to meet Yao instead. Fury looked around at everyone and said, Stand down. I invited her here. I wanted to see how Ezekiel reacted. Peggy holstered her weapon, then reached over and smacked the back of Fury's bald head as she said, You do not keep secrets from us. We are all in this together, Nicholas. The next time you want to do something, you consult with Steve, Hank, and me. Fury glared back at Peggy but said nothing. Everyone else tried not to smile at what just happened as they seated themselves back down. Once everyone was settled, the Ancient One said, Unfortunately, Yao decided to pass the mantle of Sorcerer Supreme to me almost 900 years ago, and with it, all of its problems. He didn't stick around to help a little? She shook her head and said, No, he left right after to explore the greater universe, and I haven't heard from him since. Ezekiel laughed and said, Looks like leaving your successor to fend for themselves after the mantle passes is a trait you both share. The Ancient One chuckled lightly and said, Yes, I suppose it is. Is there anything you would like to point out I might have missed or explained incorrectly so far? She shook her head and said, Honestly, you have done a fine job. How you came to acquire this knowledge concerns me, but we can talk about that at a later time. For now, please continue. I just wish to observe for now. Ezekiel nodded, then looked over the rest of the room and said, Great. So the original question about changing the timeline and still being able to change future events kind of makes sense now? Everyone nodded, but only Hank and the Ancient One seemed confident. Ezekiel laughed as his face filled up the screen again and he said, All right, so besides needing to find this base in Russia, we need enough people to take it, or a few powerful people. Ezekiel looked over at the Ancient One and asked, Would you like to help us? I am pretty sure you could toss all the base personnel into the mirror dimension. We could easily deal with them that way, and not have to worry about them sending out any distress calls. She stayed quiet for a few moments and studied Ezekiel before she said, I could agree to help if you meet me in person so we could talk. Ezekiel shook his head and said, That won't be possible for now. She smiled at that and asked, Is it because you aren't much older than 2 years old and think we wouldn't take you seriously? 00019. Exposed? You could hear if a pin was dropped in the room. Everyone was glued to the monitor and waited for Ezekiel to say something. Ezekiel looked down for a while and started to giggle, which turned into an almost maniacal laughter. After a while, he calmed down, and as he looked at the Ancient One, he said, This is why I said I didn't want to talk to you. You can be so troublesome. Fury looked at the Ancient One and asked, Are you telling me we have been working with a toddler? She shook her head and said, No, Director Fury. While his physical age might be 2, I expect his mental age to be older. He does not talk like a child after all. Ezekiel smiled and said, I am about 60 years old if you count my previous life, but I am currently 2 years old in this life. Everyone looked a little confused and Hank was the first person to talk as he asked, So you are what, reincarnated? Ezekiel nodded and said, It's different, but that is pretty close to what happened. The Ancient One asked next, Who sent you here? Ezekiel looked off to the side for a few seconds before he said, The best way to put it is the one above all. The Ancient One's calm face slowly changed and a look of complete shock and almost horror graced it before she asked, How sure are you it was someone like that? It could have just been a greater demon who is using you and sent you here as a seed. I have seen similar things happen before. You could be a threat to the entire world. I would have to check your soul for any contamination to confirm, though. Ezekiel shook his head as he smiled, before he said, It wasn't a trick and I am positive it was them and not someone lesser. While they did send me here, I made a deal and specifically asked them to do it. You don't make a deal with someone that powerful, you only make deals with entities that want your soul. I really will need to meet you as soon as possible, Ezekiel. I would recommend to everyone here not to interact with this man until I ensure that he is not a host to something sinister. Ezekiel frowned at that and said, This is why I didn't want to meet with you so early. I knew you would be a pain to deal with. I take the safety of the Earth very seriously. I will not let the possible host to an extra-dimensional threat exist on Earth while I am its magical protector. Ezekiel let out a sigh but said nothing and just stared at the Ancient One for a while. After he let out another sigh, he said, "The boss isn't gonna be happy with this. Give me about 20 minutes, and I will be back with his answer." Before anyone else talked, the display shut off and Ezekiel was gone. Everyone looked at each other in silence for a few minutes before Steve said, "This wasn't what I expected to learn today. Also, what do you think he meant by he had to ask his boss?" Coulson replied with, "Maybe he is talking about his parents, since he is so young. But who would call their parents boss?" Fury shook his head and said, "I don't know and don't really care. I want to know everything he knows and if he has been talking to anyone else besides us." The Ancient One said, "Honestly, his knowledge of this world doesn't matter, or who he has talked to. What matters is if he is a host. The world could be in serious trouble." Steve looked at the Ancient One and asked, "If he is a host, then what?" "Depending on what I find, I might destroy or banish him from this plane of existence. If I can, that is. It will depend on how strong he is." Maria spoke up for the first time and asked, "He is only a child. How strong could he possibly be?" The Ancient One looked at Maria and said, "He could have more than enough power to destroy the planet." Everyone stopped talking and looked at the Ancient One. Steve was the first to speak and asked, "Is that a joke?" The Ancient One shook her head and said, "Unfortunately, it is not. People who are hosts tend to have at least a fragment of their master's power. Depending on who it is, we could be dealing with a world-ending threat." Steve nodded his head in understanding as Fury said, "The real question is, do we still work with him if he passes the Ancient One's test?" Peggy, Steve, and Hank were quiet for a while as they thought over Fury's question. Hank was the first to speak and said, "If he passes, I will be working with him no matter what. I want to find Janet." Peggy looked from Hank to the Ancient One and asked, "If you do end up dealing with Ezekiel, could you help Hank find his wife? She is currently trapped in the quantum realm." The Ancient One glanced at Peggy, then turned to look at Hank and said, "If I work with that young girl Ava, I might be able to do it. But I make no guarantee. The quantum realm is a strange place that twists time. Also, if I teach Ava magic, she might be able to stabilize herself once she becomes proficient." Hank nodded his head at that and said, "I still don't believe in magic, but I will gladly take your help. As for Ava, you will have to talk to Bill about it." The Ancient One nodded and said, "I will discuss it with him later. But I have a question for you, Dr. Pym. What do you think advanced science looks like to someone who has never seen anything even remotely like it? A good example would be your Pym particles." He thought about it for a moment before he asked, "Magic?" The Ancient One nodded and said, "You can think of magic a little bit like a very advanced science. There are big differences between magic and science, but you get my point. Just because you have never really seen it doesn't mean it isn't real." Hank nodded in understanding, then looked at Peggy and said, "Thanks, Peggy." Peggy smiled in reply, before she turned to Steve and asked, "What do you want to do about Ezekiel?" "He just wants to help people, and I won't turn away someone trying to do the right thing." Peggy smiled as she nodded her head. She already knew Steve's answer before she asked him. She glanced at Fury and asked, "What about you?" Fury frowned a little and said, "Looks like I am already outvoted. I am not sure about working with a child, but I want the knowledge he has." The monitor screen flashed back on and Ezekiel smiled before he said, "I have the body of a child currently, but I am not a child, Fury." Ezekiel looked at the Ancient One and said, "The boss said you can come over on one condition. You have to swear to the Vishanti that you will not divulge the location to anyone else, or you lose your ability to use magic." With no hesitation, the Ancient One stood up and said, "I, the current Sorcerer Supreme of Earth, do swear under the loss of my magic that I will not share the location of this person Ezekiel with anyone else." The air simmered around the Ancient One in multicolored light, and 3 different voices spoke in sync and said, "We do so witness." The light disappeared, and the Ancient One looked at Ezekiel and asked, "Good enough?" Ezekiel let out a sigh and said, "You made me lose a bet with the boss. Go to the Sanctum Sanctorum, and then I will tell you where to go." The Ancient One nodded, looked at everyone else and said, "I will hopefully be back in a while. If something bad happens, someone will let you know." She raised her hand a little and made a quick circle. A portal appeared in the air lined in orange. A second later, she stepped through it and it closed right after. Then the monitor shut off again. Steve stood up and said, I think I am gonna go eat lunch while we wait. Does anyone care to join me? After Ezekiel called the sanctum and gave her the address, the Ancient One prepared herself for battle, before she then portaled to the backyard of a nondescript house in Brooklyn. She was greeted with a well-kept backyard that had 2 decent-sized trees in it. She focused on the house in front of her and prepared herself as she walked to the open back door. As she entered it, a voice of a child was heard from deeper inside as they said, Don't touch anything. I don't want my parents to know anyone was here. I am in the living room. She didn't drop her guard as she walked towards the sound of the voice. As she came closer, she heard the clicking of keys at a fast pace. When she entered the living room, she looked to the right and saw a child sitting on the top of a desk, with a keyboard on his lap, typing away quickly as he scanned the screen in front of him. He never looked towards her but said, Make it fast. I am busy. She quickly scanned the area around her, before she asked, Didn't you say you have a boss? Where are they? 2 houses over to the left. Just listen for a bunch of kids making a lot of noise. She didn't reply, but started to study the boy in front of her. After a while, she started to make small gestures and mumble some words quietly for a while as her eyes started to glow. After a few minutes, she stopped and said, I have no idea who you made a deal with, but you have no soul. I also don't see anything inside of you that could be controlling you either. Ezekiel never stopped typing, or even turned to look at the Ancient One but asked, What the hell are you talking about? What do you mean I don't have a soul? Everyone has a soul. The Ancient One shook her head and said, I do not see one in your body. I am not really sure how you are even alive right now. 00020. The Ancient One wants to talk. The Ancient One shook her head in pity and said, Without a soul as a container, your life force is slowly ebbing away. I can already see it. If nothing is done, you will die within a few weeks at most. Ezekiel laughed at her words and said, For being the Ancient One, you sure don't know much, do you? I will be gone by 5, before my father gets home to take a shower. The Ancient One frowned at that and said, You might be close to 60 in age and currently dying, but you should still show a little respect, young man. I have worked to keep this planet safe from threats for over 900 years. Ezekiel finally stopped typing as he rolled his eyes and said, All right, Granny, whatever you say. He started to save his work before he shut off the computer. As he did that, the Ancient One frowned a little more and said, You know I was going to try to help you, since you are not corrupted. But with your attitude, I think not. Ezekiel stood up on the desk and put the keyboard and mouse back in place before he jumped off the desk and landed on the floor. He walked closer and looked up at the Ancient One as he said, Nothing you can do could help me anyways, Granny. You would just be wasting my time, like you are now. You said you came to check me out. Are you finished, or do I need to strip naked? The Ancient One stepped back and said, No, but I want to meet your boss before I leave. Ezekiel let out a laugh as he said, You made me lose another bet, old woman. You want to meet my boss? Then take us to the mirror dimension first. The Ancient One nodded and flicked her right hand. The area around them started to break like glass. After a moment, they were both in the mirror dimension, and the Ancient One said, Now summon your boss for me. Ezekiel started to giggle, before his laughter became manic, and he said, I really wish you would have found us in a few years. It would have been more fun. You would have been dead long before then. Now summon your boss for me. Please. You know, the boss isn't gonna like this one bit. But I know you came here ready for a fight. So it would be a shame to let all that work go to waste, wouldn't it? How about you show me how well you can dance? Ezekiel's body flickered for a moment before it disappeared, and a shield glimmered into life behind the Ancient One's head where Ezekiel had just tried to punch her. The next second his body flickered. He reappeared in the air in front of her mid-punch. She gently blocked the punch with her palm and then gripped his fist. She pulled him downwards and moved him into the path of her leg as she kicked him in the chest, which sent him flying away from her. As Ezekiel slammed into the wall of the mirror dimension, she watched the boy closely and noticed his life force was depleting even faster than before. Ezekiel recovered slowly, and as he got up, he started to laugh again as he said, This body is so weak it makes me sick. The Ancient One shook her head and said, You could beat a normal human with no training, but a trained combatant, even with your speed, you would lose. You also pack no power behind your attacks, and with this amount of skill, I won't need to cast a single spell to beat you." Ezekiel started to laugh menacingly and said, "You want to bet?" The Ancient One stepped back and put up her guard as she watched Ezekiel. The boy brought his hands together as he started to make signs. She wasn't sure what they meant, but as he made them, the life force in his body began to move. Most of it started to gather in his chest area and started to spin at a rapid pace as he inhaled. When he finished, he said, "Fire-style majestic destroyer flame." A huge flame erupted from Ezekiel's mouth and sped towards the Ancient One. "May the aegis of the seraphim intertwine to protect me." A glowing orange shield bubble engulfed the Ancient One as she watched in fascination as the life force in the body of Ezekiel disappeared and turned into a giant flame spewing from his mouth. It didn't last too long, less than 15 seconds, and the boy was spent. The last bits of his life force were about to fade away as he gasped for his last breath. He said, "I win," as his body fell forward and disappeared into a puff of smoke. The Ancient One started in shock at what just happened. In all her years, she had never once seen someone act so reckless with their own life. She just stood there, staring at the spot where Ezekiel just was. Ezekiel was in the backyard walking around, practicing his control exercises when he was flooded with knowledge from his clone. He almost tripped mid-step when he saw what they had done to the Ancient One. After he stopped walking, he looked around and observed everyone in the backyard for a few seconds. He then walked towards the shed in the backyard, and once behind it out of sight, he created a new shadow clone. The clone snickered at its creator before it nodded and walked out from behind the shed. It sat down on the ground next to it and started to do his best Shikamaru impression. Ezekiel's body flickered, and he quickly scaled up the fence and over the wall into the alleyway behind the house. As he ran towards his house, his body flickered with each step, and he made it to his backyard fence in only a few seconds. He quickly ran up the fence and jumped over it into his backyard, then ran into the open back door and looked around his living room as he came to a stop. The Ancient One was still in the mirror dimension when Ezekiel flickered in front of her and looked around the house for a moment before he let out a sigh of relief and said, "I knew it would be fine, but that idiot still gave me a scare." The Ancient One snapped her wrist and pulled the new Ezekiel into the mirror dimension with her and said, "What exactly was that? I've only seen dark magic that uses life force like that." Ezekiel studied the Ancient One for a few minutes in silence before he said, "It's a personal skill I have, but it wasn't life force." The Ancient One nodded and started to cast examining spells, one after another on the new Ezekiel. Once the last spell was cast, she asked, "I assumed that you were the real Ezekiel, but what was I just talking to?" Ezekiel smirked at that and bowed as he said, "I must apologize for him attacking you, by the way. He was a clone of myself that I share memories with. They each have their own personalities and can act however they wish after I make them. But they normally act like me and less like that, most of the time." The Ancient One regarded Ezekiel as he stayed bowed, before she finally said, "Apology accepted, young man. Now I have some questions for you, and you are on a time schedule, I believe." Ezekiel stood back up and said, "I just need to program, but I will just call today a break. You have till my father comes home to ask whatever questions you want, but I might not answer them." "Who sent you here?" "They told me to think of them as the one above all. But I also know there is a one above all here, but it's not him." The Ancient One nodded and asked, "Why were you sent here?" "Because I asked to be." The Ancient One shook her head and said, "I said before that you don't ask beings like that for things. Unless you traded something for it, that just doesn't happen. I traded positive karma." "Positive karma? Like doing good deeds?" Ezekiel nodded a little as he raised his right hand and scratched the back of his head as he said, "Yes, something like that." The Ancient One examined Ezekiel for a while before she asked, "So you were a really good person in your last life or something?" "I would like to think I was." "So why here, to this timeline? You seem to know what is coming, and you aren't planning to sit on the sidelines from what you have done so far." Ezekiel laughed at that before he said, "I didn't pick this place first or even second. I picked my world first. I wanted to see my kids, but I was told that wouldn't be allowed. So I picked somewhere else, but I was told I wouldn't be able to affect the timeline much, and I didn't want to live my second life like an NPC bystander." NPC? Ezekiel smiled and said, "It's a term from video games, non-player character. If I went to that world, that's how I would feel. You should really play some video games when you have some free time. I think you would enjoy it." The Ancient One just nodded for a moment before she asked, "So this was your next choice?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, he made me an offer, an already made timeline. I wouldn't be able to change where I started, but he would give me powers I could use to shape the future of the timeline." The Ancient One frowned a little and said, "So you mostly came here because you gained powers?" "No, I would have had powers in the other worlds I went to. I had another reason for coming here, but I doubt you would understand. It's kinda childish." "Humor me." Ezekiel raised his head up at the ceiling with his eyes unfocused as he looked past it, and he said, "After I was born, I was told that I was special. It was a miracle that I was even alive." His eyes became focused as he looked at the Ancient One and said, "During my mother's pregnancy, she did everything she could to have a miscarriage. Her personal beliefs wouldn't allow her to get an abortion, and I was just a reminder of the worst night of her life. So she attempted to get rid of me in a way that wouldn't affect her soul." Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "Well, nothing worked. I somehow survived everything she put in her body to kill me. But it wasn't without a cost. I was a miracle baby, with more health issues than the average cancer patient ward. Luckily, my mind was somehow spared, and it was the one thing that kept me alive." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "My mother was forced to give me up for adoption after I was born. Not like she wanted to keep me anyways, but after the doctors figured out what she had been doing to get rid of me. Well, she was sentenced to a mental institution for her condition instead of prison. As for the man who donated the other half of my genes, he was in prison for what he did to my mother and some other women." Ezekiel sat down on the ground and started to examine his hands for a moment as he said, "You know, everyone loves a baby, unless the baby needs to be hooked up to machines just to live. I didn't even get to go to an orphanage. I had to stay under medical care for my body to function properly. I was lucky my mind worked though, otherwise they wouldn't have kept the machines on." Ezekiel laughed and said, "Apparently if you aren't considered brain dead, by law they had to keep you alive. Even a kid no one wanted. I spent the first part of my life till I was about 6 alone. Medical staff would see me every day. I would be fed, cleaned, and taken care of. But that was it. I had no true interactions with people." Ezekiel looked back up at the Ancient One and said, "While my mind did work, they still didn't try to teach me anything. They treated me like a coma patient, except I had my own room and I was placed in a long-term pediatric ward. I learned language by listening to people talk around me and the TV that they played kid shows on. I actually learned to read from watching Sesame Street." Ezekiel smiled at that, his eyes looking past the Ancient One and into an old memory. The edges of Ezekiel's eyes glimmered a little, and his voice broke slightly as he said, "Around 6 is when I made my first friend. His name was Sam. He introduced me to the world of comic books, and he is the main reason I took the deal for this world.